just a few things I wanted to touch on. Rather than go into great detail, we have a website. It's called hartlandlandtrust.org. It should be relatively easy to find. And it has all kinds of information about upcoming speaker series, information about the land trust, a lot of helpful links for things that might be of interest to you. If you're interested in volunteering, there's a button that we're working to add to that to enable you to do that. There's a variety, donate buttons, things like that. So it's a good point for a starting point for educational kind of things related to present conservation. So again, that's hartlandlandtrust.org. It also has contact information if you want to get in touch with us for any reason you have questions. And certainly feel free to ask any of us here or at other places. We're not very formal about that. The other thing I wanted to point out, Carol Vincent has some calendars over at the table there. This is our second year. They have all sorts of awesome photographs taken of wildlife in Hartland and scenes and by Hartland photographers. And it's a great fundraiser for us. They're only $15. They could make good presents, for Christmas, things like that coming up. Also, just the last thing I want to mention is we do have a fundraiser coming up again. We've done these for a few years at Flatbreads down in Canton, where the golf course used to be. Barnes & Noble is now. It's a pizza place in there. And on Tuesday, October 20th, between 5 and 9 p.m., if you buy a pizza from them, they donate a portion of that to support the land trust. And we expect to have, teacup raffle kind of things down there and so forth. So it's kind of a fun thing in the middle of the week if you want to get out, get pizza and help us out. So without dwelling any further on things like that, I'd like to introduce Dr. Sandy Anagnostakis. Dr. Sandy. And she's from the Connecticut Agricultural Experiment Station down in Haven.
Yes.
And she's here to talk to us about chestnuts. So,
okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. I'm always happy to come out and talk about chestnuts. I've been working on chestnut trees at the experiment station for 48 years now. And officially, I'm retired, but I still go in every day because I haven't quite broken the habit. But I'm going to tell you a little bit about chestnuts and some of the things I've learned about them. I will try not to block the screen here. The American chestnut, like the one you see in the picture here, was once one of the dominant trees in the Northeast. That particular tree was in Scotland, Connecticut. The photograph was taken in 1905, and the description of it said that it was 83 feet tall and 103 years old. It was part of a timber harvest, and they were studying ways to improve the woodlot and find better ways to harvest and use the forest trees. Now, chestnuts, I've said they were a common tree in the Northeast. This is a photograph that I took from some pollen people. They sample cores of the soil. They look at the pollen that they find in those cores, and they say, okay, at this level, which was 13,000 years ago, there were lots of chestnut pollen grains in various places. Every place where it's gray, they in fact found chestnut, but the big concentration 13,000 years ago was here in kind of at the corner of Kentucky and Tennessee. So that would be what would be considered the beginning of the development of chestnuts in the United States. This is the native range as it's defined by the USDA. It's a fairly wide range, but it's kind of interesting that there were few chestnuts up here in New York State. The reason I think is because the soil there tends to be rather alkaline, and chestnuts really like acid soil. So they'll grow just about any place where the soil is quite acid. And this was the range that was defined by looking at specimens in an herbarium. Now, when settlers were defining their property in the early days of New England, they very often used trees to say, my property goes from that big oak tree to that chestnut tree to the elm over there. And those were called witness trees. And the records that were kept about properties kept track of the witness trees and their size. So someone has gone through a lot of New England records and looked at the different species of trees that were used as witness trees. And I like this picture because you can see that the frequency increases. The frequency of chestnuts used as witness trees increases with the size of the spot. So even though the native range went up here and along here, there were very few witness trees that were chestnuts. Most of them in New England were in this area. And in fact, here, where we are, there were lots and lots of chestnuts that were witness trees in the records of the deeds. This is another picture from our experiment station files. It shows a stand of chestnuts. We know that those trees are 50 years old because they have been harvested, and they sprout back again from the base. So when you cut a chestnut tree, you get a whole bunch of sprouts around the base, and they grow vigorously and compete really well with everything else. They get to be 80 feet tall or 90 feet tall, and very quickly grow taller than the oaks and maples, so they could dominate a forest. And in this experiment station publication on working in the woodlot, it says that about a third of the forest trees were American chestnuts at the turn of the century. I like this description of the wood that was collected from American chestnuts, and this is a 1910 publication. This, of course, doesn't include things like railroad ties and fence posts and so forth, but this is the lumber that has been milled from chestnuts in the state of Connecticut, and it was the report for 1910. And I love the fact that most of the chestnut lumber went into musical instruments. And of course, I couldn't leave that alone. I had to find out why. And that was when I found out that Iverton, Connecticut was named that because they used to make pianos there. It was in a place where stuff could be transported easily up and down the river, and they were using chestnut lumber to make the pianos. They also used the chestnut lumber in the pipe organs that were made in the Stamford area along the southwestern coast of Connecticut. So that's why those musical instruments were the primary use for chestnut lumber. The fruit of American chestnut are small nuts. There are 3 in each burr. The burrs open in the fall to release the nuts. And very typical of pure American chestnuts, the tips of the nuts are fuzzy. They have a lot of small hairs on them so that they look white. And the nuts then fall free from the burr when they're completely ripe. But of course, there are lots of problems with chestnuts, and that's why nobody's got a lot of American chestnuts now. The first problem was one that turned up in the south. It probably came in, it's a pathogen that's called a water mold, but it's not a fungus. It's more closely related to an alga. But this organism can move in the water of the ground and infect the roots of trees. We know that that this organism was present in Portugal and was described in the 1800s, and that it was on cork oak trees. And we also know that people were importing cork oak trees to the south, to Georgia, for planting, trying to establish them there. So that's probably how the disease got in. And by the middle of the 1800s, this disease had already caused a lot of damage and had killed a lot of the native chestnuts and other chestnut species that are in the south. It fortunately doesn't overwinter up here in Connecticut. Once in a while, somebody will bring it in on a plant that they bought in the south. But it usually doesn't overwinter, so it's not something we have to worry about. But all of the people who work on chestnuts in the southern United States, actually from about New Jersey south, this is a serious problem still on all kinds of chestnut trees. Then the disease which is most famous is chestnut blight disease. We are pretty sure that this came in on Japanese chestnuts that were first imported in 1875. They were brought in because, first by accident, there was a man in New York City who was importing lily bulbs, and he had baskets, grass baskets coming from Japan containing lily bulbs. One of the baskets, instead of bulbs, had chestnuts that were the same size. And those were Japanese chestnuts. He didn't want them, so he gave them to one of his employees who lived in Stanford, who planted them in his garden. And they were remarkable and very different from American chestnuts, and everybody wanted one. And I've found 4 so far of 1875 Japanese chestnuts still growing in Connecticut. But those trees and other Japanese chestnuts that were imported after that brought in chestnut blight disease because the Japanese chestnuts were resistant to it, and the disease could be growing in the bark of those trees and not killing them. But after the trees were planted in Connecticut and New York State, every creature that walked across the surface of the cankers that resulted could pick up spores. You can see that there's a sunken area here. The fungus probably got in through this broken branch, and then it grew in and underneath the bark, and it grows until it's all the way around the stem, and that kills the tree, or at least it kills that stem. There are little orange pustules that break through the bark, and that's where the spores are formed, and everything that walks across the canker can pick up the spores and carry it to another tree. So it spreads slowly, but very efficiently. This is a report of where chestnut blight was confirmed, and I always tell people, you cannot assume that between 1908 and 1911, it spread quickly from the red dots to the yellow dots. That just means that's where people looked for it. It was probably there before, and they just didn't bother to look. And when lots of chestnut trees started dying, then they started paying attention and trying to figure out what to do about it. Now, another problem, I'm going to go through a whole list of problems here. This is a recent one. We still have chestnut trees. We have a lot of them because they still sprout from the base. They get killed back to the ground and they sprout and they grow for a while and they're killed again and they sprout again. And I always tell people that they're all still out there. They're just shorter than they used to be. A new problem that has come along, which is actually fairly serious for people who are growing chestnuts for the nuts, is a gall wasp, which was imported again from Japan. And this time came in because there was a grower in Georgia who visited Japan and saw some really nice trees, and so he made some cuttings and brought them in and did not declare them when he came through plant quarantine. And he grafted them in his orchard, and within 10 years he had eliminated his orchard. Because this insect will lay its eggs in developing leaf and flower buds, and then in the spring, when the leaf should come out and start growing, you get a gall instead, and inside that gall there are larvae of the gall wasp, and it emerges and flies to another tree. I was really worried about this. It came in 1974, and I kept expecting to find it in Connecticut, and sure enough, we did. We found it. I found it on American chestnuts on the Appalachian Trail in 1993. So that took a while, from 74 to 93, for it to get to North Georgia. But the Appalachian Trail has American chestnuts all along the trail. So all the insect had to do then was fly from one tree to another, and it got to Connecticut in 2011. So this is the map showing the distribution of gall wasps, and in light green is the range of American chestnut. And in 2011, we confirmed that it was in Connecticut, so I had yet another problem to worry about. And then the final problem, which everybody who grows chestnuts for nuts knows about: if you harvest chestnuts and you put them in your refrigerator, pretty soon little white worms crawl out of them, and your wife tells you that you can't put them in there anymore. Those little white worms are the larvae of these weevils. The weevils lay their eggs through the burr, through that spiky burr, and which I think is just amazing. But they manage to lay the eggs into the nuts that are inside those burrs. Then when the nuts ripen, the burrs open, then the natural evolution would be that the nuts fall to the ground, the eggs hatch, the larvae crawl, eat their way out of the nut, crawl down into the ground and overwinter, and then come up the next year as weevils to find another tree. There are solutions for this, but it's a big frustration for people raising chestnuts for food. So what are some of the solutions to all of these problems that chestnuts have? And obviously there are some, or I wouldn't have been working on them for so long. One of the first solutions that I started using was a virus that gets into the fungus. We saw a report in 1968 in an Italian journal that the chestnuts were recovering, and a Frenchman, who was a very clever person, went out and looked at the trees and took samples of the cankers and brought the stuff back to his laboratory and found that there was something wrong with the fungus. He wasn't sure what it was, and I wrote to him, he sent me samples, And we found out fairly quickly that it was a virus that had gotten into the fungus. Now, it doesn't kill the fungus, it just slows it down. I always use the analogy that it's like giving the fungus the common cold, because it's about that debilitated. And the result is that even though cankers still form, the tree is able to make massive amounts of callus tissue, which walls off the fungus and keeps it from killing the tree. When we found this, I thought we were home free. I thought we were going to cure chestnut blight. I would be famous. Naturally, it didn't work that well, but we tried it. Our method of treating the trees was for me to climb the trees. I don't do that anymore. But make a hole around the cankers and put in some of the infected fungus, and then the virus would transfer to the fungus causing the canker. Canker would stop expanding, and the tree would form lots of callus and continue to survive. Now, what's really interesting, I think, is we planted a small grove of pure Americans at our experiment station farm in Hamden. And this is what they look like now. It looks great from a distance, great big trees. They're now 40 years old, 43 years old. But what's important about these trees is that they're not all the same. So this is my example of not every American chestnut is created equal. There's really a lot of genetic difference. And in this small collection of 70 trees, about half of them keep dying back to the ground and sprouting and dying and sprouting. Some of them died back once, made a couple of sprouts, and those sprouts are now growing. And a smaller number never died at all. Now, we haven't done any treatments on those trees since 1984. So we know that the virus is still there and is spreading naturally from canker to canker. Probably, again, by everything that walks over the canker is carrying spores that have the virus in them. And so in a situation like this, where trees are growing under ideal conditions, we don't water them, but they're in the middle of the farm, they don't have a lot of competition, and under those conditions, certainly we can keep American chestnut trees alive, which is a good thing, because that allows me to study them.
I have a question, Steve.
Yes.
And that last picture.
Yep.
And what you just pointed out, the one on the left, which you said died and came back, is, they appear to be larger than the one that didn't die.
Well,
Are they all the
no,
same?
the ones that didn't die are bigger. These are, it's a little hard to see. There's two stems there.
The close ones.
And, yeah, the ones that didn't die at all have gotten quite large. And in fact, the guy who does the big tree records for the state of Connecticut came to our open house in August and said he had been out looking for the largest American chestnut tree. And I said, well, it's right there. He was very excited, so he measured it. So one of those trees is now the state champion. I thought it was pretty funny that he didn't, I mean, how long has he been doing this? He didn't know we were there. So I can keep American chestnuts alive, and that's good. The reason it's good that I can keep them alive is that the way to really combat any problem like this is by breeding for resistance. If you've got tomatoes with a disease, you find one that's resistant and you cross them and you make resistant hybrids and you use those. So for chestnuts, we have known for a long time that just by plain ordinary plant breeding, we could probably breed resistance. We knew that the Japanese chestnuts were resistant, and so are most of the Chinese chestnuts. So a breeding program was started in Connecticut in 1930, and it was begun by importing trees from the USDA. They had people out scouting in many countries, bringing in plant material, and lots of chestnuts were brought in from many countries. The chestnuts that were planted in Hamden, Connecticut in 1930 are still there. And that's good because that means I've got stuff to use. The breeding program started out by making crosses of resistant Asian trees with susceptible American trees, and then growing the offspring and waiting to see if they were going to be resistant. But you can't tell right away. In fact, one of my colleagues now, a guy in Virginia, claims first you wait 10 years and you see if it's pretty resistant, and by the time it's 20 years old, you can figure it probably is. But obviously we didn't want to wait that long. We've tried many things to find ways of telling whether something was resistant when it was small. It would be lovely to do it in the greenhouse when you had a whole bunch of seedlings, but nothing really works very well. When they're 5 years old or so, you can inject them with the fungus, but that's not really a good test of true resistance. So the system I'm using now is just, I make lots of hybrids. I make as many crosses as I can with American chestnut, so that my hybrids that I'm sure are resistant because they're now 40 years old, I cross with Americans again. I let them grow until they're big and they are beginning to have good timber form, and I cross them again to Americans. And by continually crossing back to American chestnuts and selecting trees that look like Americans, I think we will get to the point of having resistant timber trees. This is one of my seed orchards. It's in Griswold, Connecticut, and I love this example. There's one that I've cut down because it got chestnut blight, but here's one that's got really good timber form. It's continued to grow straight up, good apical dominance, and right next to it, one that's a nice little orchard tree, short and spreading. So that's the characteristics that are available. I can select for a timber tree that's tall and straight, or an orchard tree. If you're going to have an orchard of chestnuts, you want them short and spreading, and you want them to make nuts early and have large nuts. Timber trees, you want tall and straight. You don't want them to waste energy making nuts when they're young. You want them to put all their energy into vertical growth, and it doesn't matter how big the nuts are. In fact, American chestnuts are quite small. Yes?
Were all the American chestnuts the timber trees?
All of the American chestnuts? They were all timber trees, like the one I showed at the beginning that was 83 feet tall. That was a typical American chestnut, and that's the characteristic of the species. But fortunately, since all of those trees were planted in Hamden, I have lots of stuff to choose from, and we have an excellent collection. I put this in to give you another example. This is a seed orchard of Windsor, and there's a timber tree and there's an orchard tree. And they're quite different in the way they look. Actually, both of those are fairly resistant to blight, yes.
What causes them to develop into an orchard versus a timber tree?
I could say God, but
They're right next to each other, so you would
yes,
think that
it's in their genes. It's a genetic characteristic. And this is why it's not trivial. You can't just cross an Asian and an American and get a timber tree. It's like parents and their children. You may have a tall person and a short person. And what do their kids look like? They're tall kids, short kids, intermediate kids. So the variation in the offspring is going to be extreme if you cross two kinds of trees. Yes?
How do you even cross them? Are you moving pollen from one blossom to another?
I am moving pollen from one blossom to another. I think I have a picture of that later.
But you end up in that way just affecting one little bundle of nuts. It's not the whole tree.
That's right. So these are the species of chestnuts, and I'm really lucky that I have all of these at the experiment station. We're the only place, maybe the only place in the world that has a collection of all of the species. And I got a little nervous about that recently and have arranged to have an arboretum on Long Island where I'm taking trees and planting them, so there'll be another place where all of the species exist so people can look at them and see the difference. The American chestnut, really the tallest, straightest of the species. European, the pure European, is also a timber tree. The Chinese chestnut, not very tall. Japanese generally also. And then there are others that are called chinkapins. Now, I said that American chestnuts have 3 nuts in each bird. The chinkapins are also in the genus Castanea. They have 1 nut in each bird. So we have Allegheny chinkapins in the Allegheny mountain range, Ozark chinkapins on the Ozark Plateau. There's a dwarf Chinese chestnut that stays fairly short, and there's a Chinese chinkapin with 1 nut in each bird. And we have examples of all of these, and it was some of my predecessors found that all of them would cross with each other. Now, we all learned in biology that if you've got 2 different species, they shouldn't cross. But in the genus Castanea, all of them cross with each other perfectly well. So we can make hybrids of all kinds. Here's an Allegheny chinkapin. It's a small bush, usually, has clusters of burrs. Each of those burrs has a single nut in it. And you can see that here. The chinkapin burrs are just as the thorns are just as sharp as the chestnut burrs. This is the native range of Allegheny chinkapins. Then we have Ozark chinkapins, which are really trees. And the native range is quite restricted. It's just on the Ozark Plateau. European chestnuts in both Russia and Spain.
Can I
Yes.
just ask a question on the European? Are
Yes.
they plagued by the same sorts of problems?
Yes, they also, their biggest problem is the roof disease. They also have chestnut blight, but the virus has moved fairly effectively through Italy and is now starting to move into the northern range of European chestnut. So the virus seems to be protecting them better in the woods than it does here. Here's a Chinese chinkapin, again a fairly short tree. The dwarf Chinese chestnut, which people who grow nuts are always very excited about this, because this tree starts flowering very early in the spring and makes nuts and continues to flower until the frost kills those flowers, kills the end of kills the end of the branch. People who are growing chestnuts for nuts have incorporated this species into their orchards to try and get 2 crops a year. These are Chinese chestnuts that are in an orchard in Louisiana. This man was really proud of his orchard. Chinese chestnuts selected for a few thousand years in China to be orchard trees. There are also still some timber trees of the same species that can be found in China, and some of them in Hamden. This is one of those 1875 Japanese chestnuts. This one's at the Bee and Thistle Inn in Old Lyme. It's one of my favorite trees. I love that tree. And you can see that it's very resistant to chestnut blight. It's got cankers all over it, but the tree is resisting quite well. And I've used it in a lot of crosses. There are Japanese timber trees as well. Most of the trees that are around in cultivated form in Japan have been selected as orchard trees. So here's how we make the crosses. We want to get resistant both orchard and timber trees. It's not enough to say, well, we could plant resistant trees. We could plant Japanese chestnuts or Chinese chestnuts and grow those for nuts. But we want to improve the flavor of those species that are resistant. We want to take characteristics of some of the other species and incorporate them into the orchard types, as well as breeding trees that are timber trees that we can plant out in the woods. And it's really not hard to do both at once. So we do these crosses. We first locate the female flowers on the chestnuts. And if we're breeding for a timber tree, I would choose an American. I would find the female flowers, cover those flowers with white paper bags, and wait until those flowers were receptive, take the bag off, put on the pollen we want to use, and put the bag on again. Then we wait until the nuts are ripe. Every bag is carefully labeled with who is the mommy and who is the daddy. We harvest the nuts and overwinter them. They have to think they've gone through a winter, and then grow them up in the greenhouse in the spring. Now, if I'm breeding for orchard trees, I start with an orchard tree that's well accepted by growers, one of the cultivars. I use that as the mother, and I put on pollen of something, for instance, one of those Ozark chinkapins, because Ozark chinkapin is resistant to gall wasp. And I can use those genes in the Ozark chinkapin to incorporate gall wasp resistance into some of the better cultivars that are grown for nuts. And besides, we get to ride in bucket trucks. So people always say, oh, you've been doing this for so long. And do we now have real timber trees and real orchard trees that are resistant to every possible problem? I don't know. I hope so. I've been planting out trees in the woods for a long time. Every time I get a generation of trees, that's one generation further in the breeding for timber trees. I grow up a batch of them. I find a nice clear cut, and all of the foresters know to call me up when they're doing a timber harvest. And I plant my trees there. I protect them with tree shelters, and then I keep track of them. I go back and I watch them, and I find out which ones are resistant, which ones continue to have good timber form. And this has been going on now. I've been planting out in the woods since about 1995. And this is Sessions Woods. We have an additional twist that I use. I'm not sure those trees I'm planting are going to be the final solution. So I make sure that I'm planting them in a place where there's lots of American chestnut. Now, I said they're all still out there, they're just shorter. So if there's a timber harvest, those Americans are the first ones that sprout and start growing. So it's very easy to find them. I can go through the place where the trees have been cut, and I can put virus into all those American chestnuts. I go out with the right strains of the fungus containing the virus, put them into the American chestnuts to keep them alive, so that when my planted hybrids get big, the ones that are really good can cross with the Americans that are growing right there in that spot and are well adapted to those conditions. And the next generation, some of them will die, a few of them will survive, but eventually, by planting out pretty resistant trees and encouraging the Americans to stay alive, and then the next generation, the virus will still be there, will help keep the trees alive. And I'm hoping this will lead to reforestation, a reestablishing of American chestnuts, or nearly American chestnuts, in the woods. And the plan for orchard trees, one of the things I've been doing is testing the nuts for their nutrients, because besides making trees that are gall wasp resistant and resistant to blight and resistant to the root disease as well, I want them to taste good. We plant the trees, we let them grow. When they start fruiting, my assistant and I would walk through the orchard and we'd taste them. If we didn't like them, we'd cut the trees down. The trees that have pretty good nuts that were big were worth then testing for nutritional quality. And I can send them out to a Connecticut laboratory and have them tested, and that's the next step. I can say, these have more protein, and these have less fat, and so forth. So it's another thing to find out. Every so often, a newspaper person will call me and say, I talked to you 5 years ago, have you made any progress? I think so. I've been doing it a long time, but progress when you work with trees is really slow. If it takes 10 years for an American chestnut to start flowering, now admittedly the Japanese start flowering when they're 2, but some of the hybrids are a little quicker, but it takes a long time for each generation. So I can just keep making crosses, planting them out in the woods or tasting the nuts, and slowly, I think we will get to the point of having better chestnuts for eating. And there's, at the moment, only one commercial grower in the state of Connecticut. He sells all of his produce to Whole Foods in Massachusetts and makes a very good profit. There are lots of people with a few trees. There's some people near New Haven who had 2 very fine trees, and their children collected the nuts every year and sold them, and that was their college fund. They managed to make enough money by selling to the local grocery stores. Lots of people in Glastonbury have chestnuts. They're hybrids of various kinds. So when you go to a farm stand in Glastonbury, someplace like Rose's Berry Farm, they very often have chestnuts in the fall. The chestnuts that you buy in the supermarket usually are not very good because they've been imported and they just leave them sitting out there dry. It seems to be impossible to convince grocery people that you have to treat them like tomatoes. They have to be refrigerated, they have to be kept damp. But if you put them out dry in a bag, they're useless in about a week. So if anyone is interested in buying chestnuts for eating, I can give you a website. There are lots of growers in Michigan, on the West Coast. You can buy them from the local farm stands. And it's better to get locally grown chestnuts than to get stuff in the grocery store.
When we're all done here, if you gave me that information, you could maybe post it on my website.
Okay, yeah, I'll do that. And I have to close with this picture. This is this really big chestnut tree. We have a pretty good idea when it was planted. And the fact that it's been there, it's in a field in England, in southern England. I was trespassing. The man who owned the property didn't know we were there, but I had an informant who knew about the tree, and so we snuck onto this land to look at this wonderful old chestnut tree planted more than 1,000 years ago and still going strong. So that's my excuse for still working. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Are the leaves of the different types of trees all alike? Can
The
you tell which it is by looking at the leaves?
You can usually tell, I can tell usually from 10 feet away. American chestnuts, the leaves are thin and paper-like. They're tapered at both ends, and so they're canoe-shaped. Chinese chestnuts, American chestnuts are not only thin, but there's no leaf hairs on the leaves, so they're quite smooth. Chinese chestnuts the leaves are tough. They're usually shorter, and there's lots of leaf hairs on the backside so that it looks white, and you can feel the fur of the leaf hairs on the Chinese. Japanese chestnut, the margin, instead of being indented, American chestnut is Castanea dentata because the edges of the leaf are deeply indented. Japanese chestnuts just have little spines along the edge of the leaf. And all of the species have characteristics that you can easily see with a hand lens, and there's a key on the website. So I'll give you that information as well. You can look at my chestnut key. There are pictures of the leaves and description of how to tell them apart.
How big were the original American chestnuts when they were at 3 feet?
Well, it depends on where you were. The one I showed you earlier, which was 100 years old, or 103 years old, that was, the man standing next to it was sort of an ordinary sized person, so you could judge from that the tree was about 2 feet in diameter, not huge. It was 83 feet tall, fairly typical. But as you went further south, as you go further south, the trees were bigger. They might be 8 feet in diameter and occasionally taller. But remember when I showed you the picture of the pollen, that really the beginning of the expansion of American chestnut in the United States started there in the South. in the Kentucky, Tennessee area. So that's where they've been growing the longest. They've only been in New England since, let's see, a few hundred years, not very long. They spread north. And, but the trees in the south are bigger, or were bigger. Yes?
Around Thanksgiving and Christmas, I often see Italian chestnuts in the supermarket, but the last few years that I bought them, when I open them up, they're moldy inside. So, should I?
Well, you should buy local.
Where can I buy local?
Let's see, trying to think if there are growers near here.
I mean, there is Whole Foods in West Hartford, but if that fellow sells all of his chestnuts to Massachusetts,
They're,
fair.
the best thing to do is to buy them by mail order.
Mail order.
And there's a cooperative in Michigan that sells excellent nuts.
Michigan.
They're well grown and well protected from drying out and getting moldy.
Okay.
So I will send you that. Actually, you're probably the one who's going to get the information because it's your email that I've got.
You said the chestnuts spread up north from Kentucky, Tennessee. Was that primarily the squirrels, the 100 yards at a time, or did Native Americans get bigger transplants just because of the distances?
Well, it's hard to say. There's probably squirrels. There's pretty good evidence that Native Americans moved black walnuts around because black walnuts are native in the Midwest, and the range is now extended all the way to the east. And there are records that indicate that the Native Americans planted them. There is no information like that about chestnut. And because of the slowness of the march north of chestnut, I suspect that it happened as the glaciers receded, the soils warmed up, and the climate became better suited for chestnuts to grow. And then as the squirrels planted them, they moved north. Yes.
They compete pretty vigorously. Frequently I compete other trees. Do you envision at some point in the future that they will in fact reestablish themselves? And if they do, what trees are they likely to be doing so at the expense of?
Well, I hope they're going to outcompete red maples and black birch, because very soon that's all we're going to have left in the woods, because the deer eat everything else. Without deer pressure, we would have oaks and maples, but because of the heavy deer pressure, just about all that's left in many regions is black birch and red maple. I mentioned earlier an example of American chestnuts being an invasive species because in Wisconsin in 1880, one of the farmers planted 12 American chestnut trees that he got, we think, from Massachusetts, and they have absolutely taken over the woods. They've moved out from that original 12, and there are thousands and thousands of them. Blight got there in the 80s, I think, and so people are now trying to put virus-infected fungal strains into those trees to keep them alive. But I hope that we'll be able to have chestnuts which can compete well with some of the less desirable species.
Is the term horse chestnut, is that a particular type of chestnut, or is that just a general term? Horse chestnuts?
Yeah, horse chestnuts are not really chestnuts. I think of them as buckeyes, and they're in a completely different family. They're not related to chestnuts at all. There probably are 7 or 8 species of true chestnuts, if you include the chinkapins. But the horse chestnuts are very different.
They seem to thrive. They're not in danger, are they? The horse chestnut trees, I remember those when I was a kid.
They are not often planted these days. I confess that I've planted a lot of stuff in New Haven along the street where you're not supposed to plant. And I have a horse chestnut because I like it, and a chestnut oak, and a chestnut.
Is what you're doing through the American Chestnut Foundation, or was this just all through?
No, we were first. I'm not a member of the American Chestnut Foundation. When Charles Burnham started that organization, they got together and he hired a young man to do the breeding. And he came to New Haven every year for 4 years. He'd come up in the spring and put on bags on the flowers, come back 2 weeks later and make the crosses. Then he'd come back in the fall and harvest the nuts and take them to Virginia and plant them on the Chestnut Foundation farm. So all of their stuff originally came from ours. And then they started finding other Native American trees in the woods down there for crosses and so forth. But they used our Americans first and our resistant hybrids. Yes.
I've seen some trees with elder nuts really got a frost all over. But I have a couple of trees that never got killed with nuts, they fall off just as a little palm.
Chestnuts? Chestnuts. It's a characteristic of the cultivar, of one of the cultivars that's grown on the West Coast. They were bred to not open up and drop their nuts because on the West Coast, if they fall on the ground, they dry out by the time the people come to harvest them. So they want them to stay in the burrs, and then they run them through a couple of rubber tires together to take the burrs off. So those are selected for that. The other thing is that if the flowers aren't pollinated, the nuts inside will not develop. There'll be little flat nuts, and those burrs don't open. They just, those just fall off.
Is that Chinese chestnut or Japanese?
The cultivar that holds its nuts in the burr is a Japanese European hybrid. But there are a couple that do it, but that's the most commonly grown one on the West Coast. And in fact, lots of stuff that comes in the supermarket is Japanese European hybrid, because Japanese chestnuts are resistant to that root disease, and that's the big problem in Europe. So very early on, they made hybrids with Japanese chestnut to combat the root disease. Any other questions? Okay, I will send some stuff that you can send out by email. Things like where to buy chestnuts and where to find my key to the various species.
I'll then post it on our
And you can post it.
website and
Yes.
Facebook page, so
Good.
people can find it.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
Well, thank you, that was fascinating. I really appreciate you driving all the way to New Haven to spend that time with us. One of our traditions here is to give our guest speakers Hartland land trust map. And I just happened to arbitrarily grab a white one, and on the table over there, there's all different colors. You can trade it for whatever color.
Well, as long as there's no purple, I guess I'll stick with white.
There's even an off-white one.
Yeah, thank you.
So, well, thank you very much, and I'd also like to thank everybody here for taking the time to come visit and ask questions, and I thought this was fascinating. So,
That's